Think back to last night. You walked into your room, adjusted your pillow, pulled up the blanket, and closed your eyes. You were completely present in that moment. You heard the faint ambient hum of the house, felt the cool fabric against your skin, and perhaps replayed an embarrassing conversation from 3 years ago in your mind. You were fully aware of your surroundings, your body, and your thoughts. And then, without any warning, total void. The next thing you knew, sunlight was cutting through your blinds, your phone alarm was ringing, and 7 or 8 hours had vanished into an absolute, silent vacuum. There was no visual countdown, no smooth cinema-style fade to black, and no final conscious thought saying, "Okay, I am officially crossing over into sleep right now." By the time you reach 30 years old, you have attempted to fall asleep roughly 11,000 times. It is the single most frequent psychological transition your mind undergoes in your entire life. Yet, despite a lifetime of continuous practice, you have zero memory of the exact second it actually happens. You spend roughly 1/3 of your entire life in this state, but every single night, the entry point vanishes without leaving a single trace behind. Where does that crucial moment actually go? Why does a human brain, capable of storing decades of complex scientific data, emotional memories, and language, fail to record the single line of code that bridges wakefulness and sleep? The answer lies deep within neuroscience, where your brain actively and intentionally erases its own transition into the dark. To truly understand why this transition memory is systematically erased, we first have to dismantle one of the most common biological myths in modern culture. The idea that falling asleep is like turning off a smartphone or shutting down a computer. When you power off a phone, the screen goes dark, the internal processor stops running calculations, and no new photo or video can be saved because the camera hardware has lost electrical power. It seems completely logical to assume our brains work the exact same way. That memory stops simply because the machine turned off. Except your brain never actually turns off. Even during the deepest, quietest stages of slumber, your brain continues to consume roughly 20% of your body's total energy. That is almost the exact same amount of metabolic fuel it burns while you are wide awake, solving complex mathematical equations or navigating through heavy traffic. The brain is not powered down. Instead, a massive, highly orchestrated biological shift change is taking place behind the scenes, like a hospital night shift handing over control to the day shift. Throughout your waking hours, as your billions of neurons continuously fire, they burn energy and leave behind a metabolic chemical waste product called adenosine. Think of adenosine like an electric bill accumulating on your brain's doorstep. The longer you stay awake, the higher this chemical debt rises, gradually dragging down the alertness networks that keep you functional. This is also why caffeine works. It doesn't actually create energy. It simply blocks your brain's receptors from reading the adenosine bill, tricking your mind into thinking you aren't tired. When night falls, this accumulated chemical pressure reaches a breaking point, signaling specialized neural clusters in the hypothalamus to begin systematically turning off the wakefulness signals one by one. But the reason your memory vanishes isn't about power. It is about a total structural blockade deep within your mind's core. Deep inside the geometric center of your head sits a tiny but incredibly powerful structure called the thalamus. The thalamus acts as the grand central terminal and sensory bouncer for your entire conscious experience. Every single image you see, sound you hear, touch you feel, and taste you experience must pass through the thalamus before it gets cleared to travel up to your cerebral cortex to become a real, conscious thought. When you begin to drift off, the thalamus assumes the role of a strict security guard at a closing nightclub. it begins locking the doors to the outside world, cutting off sensory information bit by bit. Traffic noise dims, the feeling of the heavy blanket fades away, and visual processing drops to zero. Interestingly, out of all your human senses, hearing is the most stubborn and holds on the longest. This is why distant voices or a sudden drop of a mug can snatch you back to reality at the very last microsecond. But once the thalamus officially seals the gates, your conscious mind finds itself completely isolated from external reality, starved of raw incoming data. Now, combine this sensory lockdown with what is happening in your main memory storage unit, the hippocampus. The hippocampus is your temporary hard drive. For you to remember any event, the hippocampus must continuously record incoming real-time data. But as sleep approaches, the hippocampus flat out refuses to take in new information. It clocks out early, redirecting all its energy away from recording and toward offline maintenance, sorting, cleaning up, and consolidating the previous day's memories into long-term storage. Imagine an author who suddenly stops writing new chapters because they have shifted all their attention to editing yesterday's draft. Because the recording drive has switched to maintenance mode. While the sensory gatekeeper has locked the front door, the event of falling asleep occurs in a complete data vacuum. You cannot remember the moment you fell asleep simply because the internal camera was powered down before the scene even finished playing out. This transition from wakefulness to slumber is rarely a clean, linear step. Between full alertness and deep sleep lies a chaotic, surreal borderland known in neuroscience as Hypnagogia, the twilight zone of human consciousness. During Hypnagogia, your thalamus has already locked out real-world inputs, but your upper conscious cortex has not fully shut down yet. Starved of real external sensory data, the cortex reacts by making things up, generating its own internal visual static. This results in strange floating geometric shapes, phantom sounds, hearing your name called out of nowhere, or brief surreal flashes of abstract dreamscapes. It is a mini micro-hallucination trip that every single human takes every single night. Yet almost no one remembers it by morning, because the memory recording system was already taken offline. Historical geniuses like Thomas Edison and Salvador Dali were obsessed with harnessing this creative twilight state. Edison would sit in a chair holding heavy steel balls in his hands over a metal plate. As he drifted into hypnagogia, his muscles would relax. The balls would crash onto the plate, and the sudden noise would shock him awake, right in time to capture whatever bizarre, hyper-creative idea had flickered through his head before it vanished forever. But hypnagogia can also trigger one of the most jarring physical sensations known to human biology, the hypnic jerk. You are drifting off peacefully, and suddenly you feel like you are stepping off a cliff, dropping into a hole, or falling out of the sky. Your entire body violently twitches awake with a pounding heart and a surge of panic. Scientists believe this is an ancient evolutionary relic inherited from our primate ancestors who slept high up in tree canopies. As your body muscles undergo deep relaxation during the onset of sleep, an ancient, primitive part of your brainstem panics, misinterpreting that sudden loss of muscle tension as falling out of a tree. In a fraction of a second, it fires a high-voltage motor signal to slam your muscles tight and grab on for dear life. You remember that specific jolt clearly only because the massive surge of adrenaline forcibly restarts the hippocampus, bringing the recording system back online to log the panic. We tend to imagine sleep as a uniform wave of darkness that sweeps across the entire brain all at once, like flipping a master light switch. But modern neuroscience reveals a far stranger reality called local sleep. Your brain does not fall asleep as a single unified entity. Instead, different neural regions switch off at completely different times, independent of one another, like individual floors of a massive skyscraper going dark at random. One section of your brain can be in a deep sleep wave, while the section right next to it is still firing awake signals. The very first major control center to pack up and go to sleep first is the prefrontal cortex, the seat of logical thinking, time perception, critical analysis, and self-awareness. It is the part of your brain that creates the fundamental feeling of, I exist, and I am experiencing this moment, right now. Because your self-awareness hub shuts down long before the rest of your brain finishes its transition, the observer vanishes while the machine is still running. This regional shutdown imbalance is also why sleepwalking or sleep talking occurs. The motor regions stay awake enough to move the body around, while the conscious memory regions have already gone pitch black. Ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle once described sleep as a state suspended halfway between life and non-existence. In a literal neurobiological sense, he was right. Every single night, the construct of your personal identity is systematically dismantled piece by piece. To recall the exact moment you fall asleep, you would need your conscious self-awareness to be standing right there to observe its own shutdown. But by definition, once self-awareness is gone, there is no observer left in the room to write down the memory. Not being able to remember falling asleep is not a glitch or a flaw in your biological memory system. It is a protective, elegant feature of a masterfully engineered biological machine. Your brain carefully unplugs your senses, disconnects the recorder, and erases your conscious identity so it can repair, rebuild, and restore the mind you rely on every day. You surrender your conscious self thousands of times over a lifetime, trusting the brain to bring you back every morning. And perhaps that invisible boundary is the kindest design choice nature ever made for us. Because if we truly experienced the eerie, uncanny process of our own minds disassembling every single night, none of us would ever have the courage to close our eyes again.